Do MMORPGs need a story? And if they do, how should that story be constructed? When you sit down to play your favorite MMO, what kind of story experience are you hoping for? Are you playing through a barren, narrativeless land focused on making your own story with the players around you? Or are you halfway through a several thousand-hour emotional rollercoaster filled with memorable NPCs and epic boss fights written by a specialist story team? Or are you somewhere in the middle? Ultimately, does an MMO need a narrative thread to interest you? Are you happy playing through just a world? Do you want local NPCs with local problems or a grand-scale existence-threatening crisis? Do you want to be a prophesized hero or just explore a land that you're irrelevant in until you make yourself relevant? And if an MMO does try and include a story, which structure would work best? Well, after playing a few MMOs, I've identified what I think are 5 major narrative structures found in several major MMOs, so let's break them down and discuss the pros and cons of each. I'll also put on screen a visual representation of the narrative construction in relation to the rest of the game as a whole to make it easier to understand, and then after, you can let me know which story structure you like playing through the most in the comments below. So welcome, I'm Josh Strive-Hayes and this is MMOPINION, short dives into the mechanics and constructions of MMOs. Drop a like on the video or sub to the channel for more MMO stuff and ring the bell for all the future notifications. And as usual, a massive thank you to all the supporters on Patreon, Twitch and YouTube who keep the channel alive. More information on how you can support at the end. For now, let's begin. MMORPG is such a broad term that few agree on exactly what the genre even is. We've looked at this before in the video, what even is this genre? But one of the few connecting design threads is most of them have you going on some kind of pre-written adventure, the central story. In this video, I won't be looking at the contents of the stories themselves, but more the construction of how the player experiences the story. I think there are 5 dominant design choices which exist on a scale from the world is the focus to the story is the focus. So let's break them down from least story focused to most, beginning with number 1, no story at all. These are games where the world exists, the players exist, and the players exist within the world, and that's pretty much it. There's no game-made narrative, no quests, no reason to do anything within the world beyond the personal desire to actually do it. Players here are extremely intrinsically motivated. They want to live in this world, and so they will. If we had to visualize these game worlds and story relations, it would look like this: a big world with no story inherently within, but the potential for it to be added anywhere. This design is commonly found in sandbox games like Mortal Online or EVE Online. The focus is always on the ways that players can interact with the world and other players, usually building things, destroying things, and struggling to survive. But the lack of a game-created narrative doesn't mean there's no narrative at all. It just means that any narrative that does exist is purely player-made. These are games where the players will tell you to make your own fun, and that usually means talking to other players, forming alliances, and then killing others. The story of these games is created entirely through the interaction of the community. The pros of this system are complete and genuine open-ended possibility. No one knows what will happen tomorrow because the story is unwritten. Betrayals, team-ups, last-minute daring rescues, they're all genuine. And this gives games a real edge of depth. When a player does something important in these games, the player themselves becomes an important part of the community and the history of the game. Forums will talk about them, guilds will either love or hate them. An MMO with no inherent story has more potential to throw an unexpected twist at players because you can never predict what another player might do. And it's fun to know that as you are there, it is happening for real. If you're a main player in one of these games, meaning you either lead a guild or are in a big powerful clan, or you were there when the game began so the community know you, you truly feel the world is yours to shape. Now with enough players, these are the game worlds which give truly unique experiences, often making the news for the crazy things players do within them. But the downside is, these games can be more fun to read about than play, because most people are really bad at pacing stories. And player-created experiences are often ephemeral, meaning if you're not there to experience the moment they happen, you miss it forever. Spending your time building a castle and then defending it from siege sounds great, but if you build it, log off, and then log back into the castle already destroyed, that's not as great, for you anyway. The danger of live storytelling is missing it means you've missed it forever, and if the player-created narrative is being pushed forward by a few powerful guild leaders, the main players if you will, unless you are one of them, you aren't actually a main part of the story. You're effectively a background character for everyone else. These games also suffer the most if the player count falls, because without players your world has nothing going on within it, so they'll often fall into death spirals. Players leave, so the story slows down, so players leave. Repeat until the story stops. And then when someone new joins, because there's no player-made story happening and it's hard to make your own fun without other people to have fun with, they leave. The second design is optional paced stories to engage with, but not the focus of the world. Let's take the open world nature of the sandbox, but then sprinkle in optional stories throughout. Not the focus of the gaming experience, but they are there. Some players will log in and just explore the world, doing combat, gathering, crafting, never worrying about any level of narrative. And the world is fleshed out enough that that is a totally viable playstyle. But for those wanting to grasp at the thread of story, preset adventures do exist. A visualization would look like this. The world is still open, and it's a game itself, it's still a complete experience, but you've got optional pockets of story to follow within it. This would be close to old school RuneScape or RuneScape 3. The appeal of these games is the world exists outside the story but is still relevant to them. Neither needs the other, but they both enhance each other by both existing. And because the stories can exist independently of other stories, you can pace out the experience and keep it relevant to almost any player, no matter where they are in the world. You can have low, mid, and high level quests effectively everywhere, because it's open to explore the world. It's not a linear path from beginning to end, both narratively and mechanically. A new player can enjoy low-level stories and quests for the story and the experience they'll gain, and a high-level player may not need the experience, but they can still enjoy the adventure. This design lets players who value freedom and choice ignore the stories that they don't like and just go and explore, while also providing the focused goal and guidance that story-focused players want. One of the biggest advantages here is the world is still enjoyable without engaging with the narrative. You'll have a nice mix of sandbox players and narrative players existing in the same world at the same time, essentially following different but parallel paths. The downside of this design is not all of the world will be open to those who ignore the story entirely, as certain areas, enemies, and items can be locked behind story progression or quest lines. And when a new quest comes out, it itself can be the finale of a several quest-long chain. This means story-focused quest players will always have a slight advantage over the more world gameplay-focused players, as they'll have more of the world open to them. Let's move on to the third design, where stories are the focus, but each story runs independently of and concurrently with others, and each has a defined ending. This is a lesser used style, but it essentially means the game world as a whole now exists to contain multiple narrative threads within it, and each thread has a start and a finish. They don't need to follow a greater narrative altogether, and they can be experienced in any real order. For story focus, this would be your Dungeons & Dragons Online. For horizontal leveling, you could make an argument for Guild Wars 2. A visualization would look like this. It is still a complete world, but now each part of the world exists purely as a container for a specific narrative thread, a local story in each place. The main difference between this style and the previous is, in the previous style, a player may venture into the open world without a story connection simply because the world alone is enough to provide good gameplay. In this version, however, the game is focused on linking any exploration of the world with a narrative hook. You now need a reason to go into the world beyond just I want to. At this level, you're still mostly dealing with local problems and the world is still open, but every part of the world exists to house a story moment. You can still pick and choose which story you want to follow based on what sounds interesting. This is often an extremely solo-friendly experience, which is enhanced with other people but doesn't need them. Each area being self-contained means you can create a more focused, intense experience for each story moment and not worry about overwhelming the player by linking it to a greater narrative. The focus is always on the current adventure being able to stand alone, and the only real link to another adventure is the player themselves. One of the strongest advantages of this system is how the stories can stand independently and finish, giving them each satisfying conclusions, even though they may be short. This makes the world feel like a collection of short stories instead of one big epic storyline. The downside of this type of design is by connecting locations to stories, you're pushing away the player who value a sense of the world itself feeling free. And on the opposite side, you're not able to build the epic connected narratives of specific story-focused games. You're effectively losing the extreme open-ended nature of the sandbox pace and losing the extreme epic nature of a super long narrative to give lots of shorter, finished experiences. It's a very middle-of-the-road approach, which personally I really like, but this is where you're not getting the hardcore fans of either side. The fourth design is standalone stories focused on moving from story to story in a much more linear way. The visualization here would look like this, and a great example would be older Neverwinter. This design has the world exist as the container for a narrative, and the narrative is split up into more focused stories with a specific beginning and end, but the end of one will naturally flow into the start of another, either by level ranges that you'll finish a story at, or location you'll end up on the map. Or, and this is the most egregious example, a new expansion releases and makes the previous zones less relevant. To use Neverwinter as an example, when an expansion releases, it brings with it a new map location, new weapons, armor, loot, enemies, and dungeons, possibly even a level cap increase, and every player is encouraged to go there because the lowest and most basic items of that expansion are usually as good, if not better, than the top items in the previous. But narratively, it may not follow on, so mechanically you're going to want to go there, but narratively it is its own story. The pros of this system are every new expansion serves as an onboarding point for new players. You don't need to play through years of content or context to get to the good stuff because each story is good stuff itself. And because each story has a new area and is self-contained, you're never left behind from the top elite players. It's essentially a soft reset every new section, every new story, making it very appealing to more casual players. And having a focused story moment also centralizes the player base and makes the game feel active. Everyone is experiencing that story moment together, which makes finding groups for new content really easy because everyone's doing the new content. This keeps the newest part of the game very much alive. The cons of this system are the same soft reset which new players value can be very demotivating for hardcore elite players. Knowing that your mechanical progression through the previous story section will be irrelevant when the new section begins can make players question, why am I chasing power when I'm just going to be given more power if I wait? This is the kind of narrative and mechanical construction that values having new player onboarding points far more than having long-term meaningful progression. Games like this often see huge amounts of player churn, but they're always at least active on the latest bit. Stories in this design system are also effectively time-gated to experience at their peak, as they mostly exist to give mechanical gameplay. And returning to play older stories within these games will give you almost no mechanical advantage and not open up more of the world. So very few players will do that, which makes finding groups for older content much harder. In a way, you have a very limited time to experience any story moment as it's meant to be experienced before it falls into irrelevance and the player base just move on. And the fifth and final overall design style is the game has one main story which everything is pushing towards. Any updates or expansions will add on to or continue this story, but are not themselves onboarding points for new players. The world may have gameplay elements within it, but the focus is always on the main narrative, and you need to start at the start. This would be your Final Fantasy XIV up to Endwalker, and the core plot of most of the Elder Scrolls Online. A visualization might look something like this. Similar to the previous in its linear nature, the difference being where the previous one had stories self-contained and then moved on from, this one has one story constantly added to. This level of story focus places the inbuilt narrative front and center. The majority of the design decisions are now about getting the player to experience the story. Now, it's important to remember that there may be side distractions or small parts of the world within these games that a player can still enjoy without engaging with the narrative, like the Golden Saucer in Final Fantasy XIV, or just running around discovering crafting benches in the Elder Scrolls Online. But when a new player does want to get into the narrative, and the game will always push you to do that, they must begin at page 1 and journey all the way through. The advantage of this system is it allows the greatest scope for an absolutely epic tale to be told, with lots of locations, lots of NPCs, multi-year long narrative arcs, emotional peaks and troughs. Players can form long-term connections with NPCs and feel genuinely affected if they succeed or fail at their missions. For the players willing to invest in a long-term story, this design has the most potential payoff because it can provide the most setup and potentially the most most satisfying endings. Players can also feel safe investing time into the story because they know it won't suddenly become narratively or mechanically irrelevant when the next expansion pops up. So you end up with a very invested, very large player base all experiencing one story together. The downside, however, is new players can see this as extremely intimidating to get into. The well-known attitude of you have to play hundreds of hours of Final Fantasy XIV before it gets good puts a lot of players off, with many opting to buy level boosts and story skips, missing the years of context which make the later story so good. Another ironic downside of this is, despite the fact this design does have the potential to give the most satisfying ending, it also has the most risk if it does end. Writing a satisfying story from humble beginnings to epic conclusion is effort and time for both the writing crew and the players who need to get invested into it. It is a huge time sink to actually care about a landmass or a narrative or a collection of NPCs over a long period of time. And when that story finally concludes and ends, although it's satisfying, it is effort to get them invested into another story. You could just choose to never actually end that story and just add in more and more bad guys and more stakes, but if you do that, you run the risk of never ending the story and running into constant power creep, which becomes draining. This is what happened to World of Warcraft, because resetting the game to effectively zero and starting from humble beginnings again doesn't feel good for the long-term players. This is why Cataclysm was such a risk. Changing around the long-term story that people knew and expecting them to get invested into the start of something new was difficult. So while yes, long-term stories do have the greatest potential payoff, they also ironically have the greatest danger if you ever do reach that payoff. Games with lots of small stories can finish the story because the story itself is enjoyable and it's not too draining to get into, enjoy, and then move on from. If a story is multiple years long, ending it means you are going to lose players who are invested in it. This design means a player always has a suggested narrative to follow for both their level and in-game location, and will essentially always have the same adventure as everyone else in the same order. There's very few to no unique player-made adventures to be had in these narrative-focused games. So 5 overarching narrative construction blueprints. No story at all, just an open world to play in and create a narrative if you want with other players. A world to play in with small narrative moments contained within it that are not the focus. A world centered around stories, with each running independently and simultaneously. A world focused on stories running in a linear one after the other design, with each being an onboarding point for that story and leaving the previous behind. And a massive overarching story told over many years and many updates. Now, some MMOs will contain multiple examples of the above 5 styles. RuneScape is an open world game, but it does also have long-running epic storylines. Final Fantasy XIV does have an epic storyline, but also the self-contained class and job quest lines. Many MMOs will try and mix in different narrative structures for different parts of their game, but most will have a rather obvious overall approach relating to one of the above 5. Personally, I'm not a big fan of the first or fifth style. Having no story to me feels a bit too open, and having a single focus story feels a bit too restricting. I like MMO games which sit within the middle 2, 3, and 4. Choices. Worlds which can stand on their own merits that I can explore without being narratively engaged, and narratives that I can engage with to enhance the world that I'm in. I think this is why games like old school RuneScape, Guild Wars 2, and The Elder Scrolls Online appeal to so many middle-of-the-road MMO players. There's enough variety within them when it comes to narrative structure that most players can find a playstyle they like and just do that. You're not appealing to the hardcore of either side. But what do you think? And which narrative structure do you enjoy playing through the most? Are you a no-story open-world sandbox person, or a purely narrative story follower? Let me know in the comments below. Cheers for watching. Another massive thank you to all the supporters on Patreon, Twitch, and YouTube who keep the channel alive. You can support from only £1 a month. Check the video description for links to the Patreon, Twitch, Twitter, and our Discord. And as always, have a great day.